She fell asleep on a stranger's shoulder. She didn't know he was a mafia boss. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character. She only meant to rest for a minute. She never imagined that one quiet moment would place her in the safest and most dangerous seat in New York. The last downtown train rattled through the tunnel just after 11:30 p.m., carrying the kind of passengers who kept their eyes lowered and their thoughts to themselves. Abigail Harper slipped inside moments before the doors closed, her oversized canvas tote hanging from one shoulder, while a paper bag filled with unsold pastries rested against her chest. Flowers still dusted the sleeve of her faded blue sweatshirt, and one stubborn curl refused to stay tucked beneath her knit cap. She let out a tired sigh, scanned the nearly empty car, and settled onto the nearest open seat without paying much attention to the man beside her. It had been one of those impossible days that seemed determined to test every ounce of patience she possessed. She had burned 2 batches of cinnamon rolls before sunrise, spilled an entire gallon of milk across the bakery floor, accidentally locked herself inside the walk-in refrigerator for nearly 10 minutes, and finished the evening by dropping a birthday cake in front of a customer who somehow laughed harder than she did. Embarrassing moments followed Abigail the way rain followed dark clouds, but she always found a reason to smile again. Tonight, however, even her optimism felt heavy. She had worked almost 18 straight hours because another employee called in sick, and every muscle in her body begged for sleep. She rubbed her eyes and leaned back as the train gently rocked from side to side. Beside her sat a man dressed in a perfectly tailored black overcoat. He looked like someone who belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine rather than a nearly empty subway car. Broad shoulders filled the seat with quiet confidence, while dark ink disappeared beneath the collar of his coat and climbed along the side of his neck before fading beneath neatly trimmed hair. Another intricate tattoo curved around one hand resting calmly on his knee. His expression revealed almost nothing, yet people entering the car instinctively chose seats farther away, offering respectful glances before looking. Elsewhere, no one recognized him by name, but many recognized the feeling he carried into every room. Damien Moretti noticed the young woman almost immediately. She looked exhausted in a way that couldn't be faked. Her sneakers were dusted with flour, one shoelace had come untied, and a tiny smile appeared every time she glanced at the paper bag protecting what was left of the pastries she planned to donate to a neighborhood shelter before going home the next morning. She reminded him of ordinary life, something he had not experienced in years. Across the aisle, 2 members of his security team watched silently from separate seats, communicating only through brief glances. One of them noticed a familiar face entering the next subway car through the connecting doors. The man wore a baseball cap, pulled unusually low despite the late hour. He wasn't looking at anyone else. His attention stayed fixed on Damien. The bodyguard reached toward the microphone hidden beneath his jacket, but stopped when Damien lifted one finger without turning his head. Wait. Observe. Nothing more. Damien's eyes never left the reflection in the dark subway window. Whoever had followed him had planned carefully. They weren't rushing. They were measuring distance, timing, opportunity. That bothered him far more than open confrontation ever could. The train slowed for another station, and passengers stepped off while only a few climbed aboard. Abigail blinked once, fighting sleep. She promised herself she would stay awake until her stop only 3 stations away. 30 seconds later, her eyelids surrendered. Her head tipped gently to one side before settling against Damien's shoulder as naturally as if it had always belonged there. A quiet hush seemed to settle over the car. One bodyguard stood halfway from his seat, waiting for permission to intervene. Damien remained perfectly still. The warmth of her head against his shoulder surprised him more than he cared to admit. She didn't flinch. She didn't recognize him. She wasn't pretending. She was simply too tired to keep pretending she was strong. Damien slowly lowered the phone in his hand and gave the smallest shake of his head. His guard immediately sat back down. Then Damien looked toward the subway window once more. The man in the baseball cap had stopped watching him. Now he was watching the sleeping woman instead, and for the first time that night, Damien realized the danger was no longer following only him. The train rolled deeper beneath the city, its steady rhythm blending with the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Abigail remained asleep, completely unaware that every passing second was changing far more than her route home. Her breathing stayed slow and peaceful, and one hand still loosely held the paper bag filled with pastries that had survived the longest workday of her week. A small handwritten note peeked out from the top. It simply read, "For anyone who needs a little kindness tomorrow." Damien noticed it without moving. For reasons he could not explain, that single sentence lingered in his mind longer than any business report he had read that day. Across the aisle, Vincent shifted slightly in his seat before speaking through the nearly invisible earpiece hidden beneath his collar. "He is still there." Damien answered without turning his head. "I know. Should we change cars at the next stop?" Vincent asked quietly. "No." The answer came without hesitation. Damien continued watching the reflection in the window instead of looking directly at the man wearing the baseball cap. Experience had taught him that patient observers often revealed more than impatient ones. The stranger never reached for a phone. He never spoke to anyone. He simply watched. Yet something about his timing felt rehearsed. Another station came and went. Abigail stirred for a brief moment, mumbling something too softly to understand before settling comfortably again. Damien glanced downward. A faint streak of flour remained across her sleeve, and one loose curl rested against his coat. Most people approached him with calculated smiles, hidden agendas, or quiet fear. This woman had offered none of those things. She had unknowingly trusted him more completely than anyone had in years. The thought was strangely unsettling. The train slowed once more. This time the stranger stepped onto the platform. Instead of staying aboard, Vincent rose immediately. "I will follow him." Damien gave another subtle signal. "No." Vincent frowned. "Sir, if he wants us to follow, then someone else is waiting." Vincent understood immediately and sat back down. Damien rarely explained his decisions, but they almost always proved correct. Abigail suddenly opened her eyes. For 2 wonderfully peaceful seconds she smiled, still caught between dreams and reality. Then confusion spread across her face. She looked at the expensive black coat beneath her cheek, slowly lifted her head, and found herself staring into calm gray eyes. Color rushed into her face so quickly it almost matched the red scarf wrapped around her neck. "Oh my goodness," she blurted. "I am so sorry." She jumped to her feet so fast that the paper bag slipped from her lap. 2 pastries rolled across the subway floor before she managed to catch the bag. As she bent down to grab them, her oversized tote swung forward and accidentally bumped Damien's coffee, which had been resting untouched beside him. The cup tipped just enough for a small splash to land across the sleeve of his coat. Abigail froze in complete horror. "No, no, no. I made it worse." She searched frantically through her bag before pulling out a handful of napkins, a tiny notebook, 3 pens, a measuring spoon, and somehow a rubber chicken keychain that squeaked loudly the moment it hit the floor. Even Vincent struggled not to smile. Abigail closed her eyes for one painfully long second. "Please pretend none of that happened." Damien looked at the ridiculous little toy lying beside his polished shoes. Then he looked back at the woman whose expression pleaded for the earth to open beneath her. The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was almost invisible, but everyone who knew him noticed it immediately. Abigail blinked in surprise. She had expected annoyance, perhaps even anger. Instead, he accepted one napkin, gently wiped away the few drops of coffee, and handed the napkin back. "It is only coffee," he said evenly. The train announced the next station. Abigail glanced toward the doors and gasped. "That is my stop." She hurried toward the exit before suddenly turning back. "Thank you for not pushing me away." The door slid open. She rushed onto the platform, waving awkwardly before disappearing into the late-night crowd. Damien remained seated long after the train began moving again. His gaze followed the empty platform until it vanished into darkness. Then Vincent quietly leaned forward. "Do you want us to learn who she is?" Damien remained silent for several seconds before answering. "Someone already has." "Find out why." Morning sunlight spilled across the front windows of Maple and Grain Bakery, painting warm squares across the worn wooden floor while Abigail Harper balanced 3 pastry boxes, a fresh pot of coffee, and far more confidence than the situation deserved. 2 steps later, the top box slid sideways. The coffee tilted dangerously, and she performed an awkward little dance that somehow saved everything except one blueberry muffin, which landed upside down on the welcome mat. She looked toward the empty shop, sighed dramatically, picked it up, and whispered, "You deserved better than that." Her coworker Mia laughed so hard she nearly dropped a tray of croissants. Abigail laughed with her because that had always been easier than feeling embarrassed. She brushed a few crumbs from her sweatshirt and returned to arranging the display case, never noticing the dark SUV parked across the street. Inside the vehicle, Vincent lowered a pair of compact binoculars. "Her routine matches everything we found," he said quietly. 28 years old. Lives alone. Works 6 days a week. Volunteers twice a month at the community shelter. No criminal history. No suspicious financial activity. Everyone who knows her describes her exactly the same way. Damien looked through the windshield without speaking. "Kind." Vincent nodded. "Almost annoyingly kind." Damien's eyes drifted toward the bakery window, just as Abigail handed a free cookie to a little boy whose mother searched her purse for loose change. Abigail smiled and simply waved away the apology. The child grinned as though he had been handed treasure instead of a cookie. Damien watched the exchange in silence. People often revealed who they truly were when no reward was waiting. Across town, another pair of eyes watched the same bakery through the lens of a camera hidden inside a delivery van. Nathan Cross studied several photographs spread across the passenger seat. One showed Damien boarding the subway the previous evening. Another showed Abigail stepping off the train. A third captured the brief moment she had leaned against Damien's shoulder while sleeping. Nathan tapped the last photograph with one finger and smiled faintly. "Interesting," he murmured. His assistant glanced over. "Do you think she matters?" Nathan folded the photograph carefully instead of answering immediately. "That is exactly what I intend to discover." Back inside the bakery, the morning rush arrived all at once. Abigail hurried from customer to customer, greeting each person with genuine warmth even when she accidentally gave someone oat milk instead of whole milk or nearly wrote, "Happy Retirement," on a birthday cake before catching herself in time. The customers laughed because her mistakes never felt careless. They felt wonderfully human. Around noon, the bell above the entrance chimed again. Abigail looked up while wiping flour from her hands. Her smile froze for just a heartbeat. The man from the subway stood near the door wearing a charcoal sweater beneath a simple jacket, looking far less intimidating than he had the night before. Without the black overcoat, he almost blended into the lunchtime crowd, though something about the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself still made the room seem slightly smaller. Abigail walked over with a nervous smile. "Please tell me you are not here, because I permanently ruined your coat." Damien glanced down at his sleeve as though checking for damage. It survived. Relief spread across her face. "That is the best news I have heard all day." She reached behind the counter and placed a small paper bag in front of him. "This one is on the house. I promise nothing inside has touched the floor." Damien looked at the bag before meeting her eyes again. "I believe you." She laughed softly. "That makes one of us." Before Damien could answer, the bell above the entrance rang again. A man wearing a delivery uniform stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. He looked directly at Abigail. "Delivery for Abigail Harper." She frowned in confusion. "I did not order flowers." "No card?" Mia asked. The delivery driver shook his head. "Only instructions to place them in her hands." Abigail accepted the bouquet politely, but as she adjusted the ribbon, a tiny silver key slipped from between the stems and landed on the counter with a sharp metallic click. Every smile in the bakery faded. Damien's attention locked onto the unfamiliar key, and for the first time since entering the shop, he looked genuinely concerned. The tiny silver key rested on the glass counter, no larger than Abigail's thumb, yet it somehow seemed to pull every pair of eyes toward it. She carefully lifted it between 2 fingers and turned it over. There were no initials, no number, no tag explaining where it belonged. "That is strange," she said with a puzzled smile. "Maybe it fell into the flowers by accident." The delivery driver frowned. "I picked those up already wrapped. I never opened them." Mia leaned closer. "Maybe it is romantic." Abigail laughed. "If someone is trying to impress me with mysterious keys, they definitely skipped a few important steps. Her lighthearted joke earned a smile from several customers, but Damien remained unusually quiet. He had learned long ago that accidents rarely arrived wrapped in perfect timing. He studied the bouquet without touching it. Fresh lilies, expensive ribbon, professional arrangement. No card, no florist sticker, nothing that could identify where they came from. Deliberately anonymous. Abigail noticed his thoughtful expression. You look like you were trying to solve a detective show. Damien finally spoke. Do you know anyone who would send this? She shook her head. Unless my grandmother suddenly became very mysterious, not really. She looked down at the flowers again before adding with an embarrassed grin. My dating life is so quiet that even my neighbors stopped asking about it. Damien almost smiled again. Almost. Outside the bakery, a man wearing headphones paused beside the window just long enough to glance inside before continuing down the sidewalk. Vincent noticed him immediately from the parked SUV across the street. Another observer, he quietly reported through his concealed earpiece. Damien heard every word without changing his expression. Do not approach him. You think they are testing us? Vincent asked. I think someone wants me to notice exactly what they choose to reveal. Abigail placed the key inside the pocket of her apron. If nobody claims it, maybe I will finally have an excuse to clean every junk drawer in my apartment. Mia laughed. Knowing you, you will probably discover it opens a closet full of forgotten Christmas decorations. Or a storage unit full of expired canned soup, Abigail replied. That sounds much more realistic. Their easy laughter briefly softened the strange atmosphere, but Damien noticed something neither woman could see. The delivery driver kept glancing toward the front window, as if waiting for something that never happened. After politely saying goodbye, he left without asking for a signature. That bothered Damien even more than the key itself. Once the driver disappeared around the corner, Damien stood. Thank you for the pastries. Abigail smiled warmly. Thank you for proving that not every customer disappears forever after one awkward subway encounter. As he reached the door, she suddenly called after him. Wait. Damien turned back. She hurried over holding a small white bakery box tied with blue string. You paid for one pastry, but I accidentally packed 2 cinnamon rolls. Consider the second one compensation for using your shoulder as a pillow. Damien accepted the box. You keep apologizing for something that did not bother me. Abigail blinked, slightly surprised by the honesty in his voice. Well, thank you. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise beyond the windows seemed farther away than before. Then Damien gave a polite nod and stepped outside. From the opposite side of the street, Vincent quietly joined him. The delivery company does not exist, he reported. The address on the receipt belongs to an empty building. Damien looked back through the bakery window. Abigail was laughing with Mia again, completely unaware that her ordinary afternoon had already become part of someone else's carefully planned move. Across town, Nathan cross-examined a live security image on his tablet showing Damien leaving the bakery with the small white pastry box in his hand. He slowly closed the screen and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Perfect, he whispered. He made the choice himself. Now let us see how far he is willing to go for a woman he believes he met by chance. The rest of the afternoon passed with surprising calm, yet Abigail could not stop thinking about the tiny silver key tucked safely inside her apron pocket. Every few minutes, she reached down to make sure it was still there, almost expecting it to disappear as mysteriously as it had arrived. By closing time, she had convinced herself that someone would eventually call the bakery asking about a missing key, but no phone call ever came. She locked the front door, waved goodbye to Mia, and stepped into the cool evening carrying her canvas tote and another small bag of leftover pastries destined for the neighborhood shelter. A few blocks away, Damien sat inside the back seat of a black sedan parked where he could quietly watch the bakery entrance without attracting attention. The untouched cinnamon roll Abigail had given him rested inside the white bakery box beside him. Vincent glanced into the rearview mirror. She follows the same route every evening. Damien looked through the window as Abigail stopped to greet an elderly man sitting outside a corner grocery store. She handed him one of the pastries with the same warm smile she had given every customer that day. The man thanked her with genuine gratitude, and she simply wished him a good night before continuing down the sidewalk. Damien spoke almost to himself. She never checks whether anyone is watching. Most people hope someone is, Vincent replied. Damien said nothing. Kindness offered without an audience carried a different kind of value. Abigail reached the subway entrance, but suddenly stopped. She searched through her bag, then patted every pocket of her jacket before letting out a dramatic groan. Please tell me I did not do that. She emptied half the contents of her tote onto a nearby bench. Measuring spoons, notebooks, lip balm, receipts, pens, a tiny flashlight, and the squeaky rubber chicken keychain appeared one after another. People walking by smiled at the unusual collection. Abigail sighed. I lost my apartment keys again. She rubbed her forehead before remembering the mysterious silver key. With a hopeful shrug, she pulled it from her pocket, laughing at herself. Imagine if today decided to become even stranger. Of course, it did not fit her apartment lock. She laughed anyway. Damien watched from across the street as she gathered everything back into her bag. Without warning, a delivery truck pulled into the curb directly between Abigail and an impatient taxi. The taxi driver leaned on the horn, startling Abigail just enough for her tote to slip from her shoulder. Papers scattered across the sidewalk like leaves caught in the wind. Before she could chase them, a tall figure stepped forward, catching several pages before they reached the street. Abigail looked up and blinked. Either New York is much smaller than I thought, or we have the most unusual luck. Damien handed her the papers one by one. Perhaps both. She smiled as she accepted the last page. Thank you. Again. Her stomach growled loudly enough for both of them to hear. Abigail covered her face in embarrassment. Please pretend that was somebody else's stomach. Damien's expression softened. Have you eaten dinner? She hesitated. Does sampling broken cookies count? Not really. She laughed. Then I suppose the answer is no. Damien glanced toward a quiet Italian restaurant across the street where warm lights glowed through large windows. It was elegant without feeling intimidating. Join me. Abigail looked from the restaurant back to him, clearly surprised. As a thank you for almost destroying your coat twice? As dinner, Damien answered simply. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. Instead, she found calm patience. Finally, she smiled. All right, but I should warn you. I have a remarkable talent for saying the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. I noticed, Damien replied, and for the first time she heard unmistakable humor in his voice. They crossed the street together, completely unaware that from the second floor of a building opposite the restaurant, a camera lens quietly followed every step they took, while Nathan Cross watched the live images appear on his screen and whispered, exactly where I wanted them. Soft piano music drifted through the restaurant as Abigail followed Damien to a quiet table near the window. Warm golden lights reflected against polished wood, and the smell of fresh basil and baked bread filled the room. She paused beside her chair before quietly whispering, I should probably warn you that I have never eaten somewhere this fancy. Damien pulled out the chair for her with effortless courtesy. Then tonight can be your first. She laughed nervously as she sat down. You say that like people collect expensive restaurants the way I collect mismatched measuring spoons. Damien took his seat across from her, noticing the way she looked around with genuine curiosity instead of trying to impress anyone. It felt strangely refreshing. A waiter greeted Damien with unmistakable respect before quickly hiding his surprise. Good evening, sir. It is wonderful to see you again. Abigail smiled. So you are a regular. Damien nodded once. Occasionally. After the waiter walked away, Abigail picked up the menu, stared at it for several seconds, and quietly lowered it again. Can I confess something? Of course. I cannot pronounce half of these. Damien looked at the menu before sliding it gently aside. Then allow me to recommend something. She grinned with obvious relief. Thank you. You just saved me from confidently ordering something I would accidentally describe as pasta with extra confidence. Damien almost laughed aloud. Instead, a quiet smile settled naturally across his face. During dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than either of them expected. Abigail spoke about growing up with grandparents who believed every problem could be solved with homemade pie and enough patience. She admitted she still burned cookies whenever she became distracted by daydreaming. Damien listened carefully, asking simple questions rather than dominating the conversation. When she asked about his work, he answered honestly without revealing everything. I manage several companies. She tilted her head. That explains why you always look so calm. I cannot even manage my grocery list. Appearances can be misleading, Damien replied. Before Abigail could answer, the waiter returned carrying their meals. As he placed Damien's plate on the table, his sleeve shifted just enough to reveal part of the intricate tattoo extending beneath Damien's cuff and across the back of his hand. Abigail noticed the detailed black ink immediately. Her eyes drifted upward, catching another glimpse where the design disappeared beneath the collar of his sweater. "Those are beautiful," she said sincerely. "They look like they tell a story." Damien glanced at the artwork on his hand. "Some stories stay with you longer than others." She nodded thoughtfully without pressing further. Across the dining room, two businessmen entered the restaurant. One of them froze for the briefest moment after recognizing Damien. He leaned toward his companion and whispered something too quietly for Abigail to hear. Both men immediately chose a table on the opposite side of the room, their respectful distance impossible to miss. Abigail noticed the unusual reaction. "Do people always seem nervous around you?" she asked with a playful smile. Damien answered carefully. "Some people mistake silence for intimidation." She considered that for a moment before shrugging. "Well, I think you are quieter than intimidating." For the first time in many years, Damien found himself appreciating how little she knew about him. Outside, rain began falling gently against the restaurant windows. Several stories above the street, Nathan Cross watched live security footage from multiple camera angles. His assistant stepped beside him. "Should we move to the next phase?" Nathan folded his hands calmly. "Not yet. Let them become comfortable first. Trust always creates the strongest leverage." Back inside the restaurant, Abigail reached into her purse to pay for her half of the meal, but instead of her wallet, her fingers touched the mysterious silver key. She pulled it out absent-mindedly and placed it on the table. Damien's expression changed instantly. Etched into the side of the key, barely visible beneath the polished metal, was a tiny engraved symbol he recognized immediately, a symbol that had disappeared from his world many years before and should not have existed in Abigail Harper's hands. Damien kept his eyes on the tiny engraving without reaching for the key. Years of discipline prevented even the smallest reaction from appearing on his face, yet his thoughts moved faster than ever. The symbol etched into the polished metal was nearly invisible unless the light struck it from the right angle. Most people would mistake it for a scratch. He knew better. It belonged to a private vault network that had quietly disappeared almost 10 years earlier after the death of a trusted ally. Every official record claimed every key had been recovered. Clearly, someone had lied. Abigail noticed the change in his expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly. Damien looked up. "May I see it?" She handed him the key without hesitation. "Sure. I have been trying to figure out what it opens since yesterday." He turned it over carefully between his fingers before returning it to her. "Where exactly did you get this?" Abigail rested her elbows on the table as she tried to remember every detail. "A delivery driver brought flowers to the bakery this afternoon. There was no card, no name, nothing. The key fell out of the bouquet while everyone was watching." Damien remained silent for a moment. "Do you still have the flowers?" "Probably. Mia left them in a bucket of water behind the counter before we closed." She smiled awkwardly. "I thought maybe someone had a secret admirer with terrible organizational skills." Damien did not smile this time. "Do not throw them away." Abigail tilted her head. "You really think they matter?" "I think someone wanted to be certain you found that key." She leaned back, suddenly less amused than before. "That is a little unsettling." Trying to lighten the mood, she reached for her glass of sparkling water, only to bump the edge of the table with her elbow. The glass wobbled dramatically before Damien caught it with one steady hand a split second before it tipped over. Abigail stared at him before laughing at herself. "I should probably wear a warning label wherever I go." "You have unusual timing," Damien replied. "That is a very polite way of describing me." She smiled, but this time the smile faded more quickly. The mysterious key no longer felt like an innocent accident. Outside, the rain had become heavier, washing bright reflections across the streets of Manhattan. Vincent quietly entered the restaurant, stopping beside Damien's table just long enough to speak in a calm voice. "Your car is ready whenever you are." Abigail looked at him politely. "Hello." Vincent returned the greeting before stepping away. As he walked toward the entrance, he discreetly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, revealing a small communication device hidden beneath his cuff. Abigail noticed it for only a second. Her eyes drifted back toward Damien. Your companies must be very important. Damien answered honestly, though not completely. Some responsibilities require additional security. She accepted the explanation with a simple nod. She had no reason not to. Hundreds of successful business owners hired protection in New York. The thought passed almost as quickly as it arrived. Several minutes later, they stepped outside beneath the restaurant awning. The rain had softened into a light drizzle. Damien opened a black umbrella and held it over both of them as they walked toward the waiting sedan. Abigail smiled. You know, this evening turned out much better than I expected. Even with the mysterious key, he asked. Especially with the mysterious key, she replied. At least my life is becoming less predictable. Before Damien could answer, a familiar delivery van rolled slowly through the intersection across the street. It did not stop. It simply continued past the restaurant before disappearing into traffic. Abigail barely noticed it. Damien did. So did Vincent. Through the tinted side window, a camera lens was pointed directly at them. Hundreds of feet away inside an office overlooking the city, Nathan Cross watched the live video feed with quiet satisfaction before placing another identical silver key into a small velvet box. She found the first one exactly on schedule, he said. Now let us see whether Damien protects the woman or chases the truth. He cannot do both forever. The ride across Manhattan felt quieter than the evening itself. Rain traced slow paths down the windows of Damien's sedan while the city shimmered beyond the glass in streaks of gold, white, and crimson. Abigail sat comfortably in the passenger seat, still holding the mysterious silver key inside her palm. She turned it over again, hoping that somehow another clue would magically appear. I have spent almost 24 hours trying to imagine what this thing opens, she said with a small laugh. The best idea I have so far is an old mailbox full of unpaid bills. Damien glanced toward her with the faintest hint of amusement. You always expect the simplest explanation. Life is complicated enough already. She smiled toward the rain outside. Simple keeps me optimistic. Damien looked forward again, though her words remained with him. In his world, nothing was ever simple. Every unexpected gift carried a purpose. Every coincidence demanded another question. Yet sitting beside Abigail somehow made those rules feel less certain. The sedan stopped outside her apartment building, a modest brick structure tucked between a laundromat and a neighborhood bookstore. Abigail gathered her bag before looking toward Damien. Thank you for dinner. I had a really nice time. So did I, he answered honestly. She looked pleasantly surprised. You know, I thought you would be impossible to read forever, but I think you are secretly nicer than you pretend to be. Damien almost answered before stopping himself. There was no safe response to that observation. Abigail laughed softly. See? You are doing the mysterious silence thing again. She reached for the door handle, then suddenly remembered something. Opening her tote, she pulled out one last cinnamon roll wrapped carefully inside wax paper. I forgot this one. It survived my workday. That alone makes it impressive. Damien accepted it without hesitation. Thank you. Good night, businessman. Good night, Abigail. She stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the building with a cheerful wave. Damien waited until the apartment lights on the third floor switched on before speaking. Vincent. Yes, sir. Double the surveillance around this block. Quietly. She cannot know. Vincent nodded. Already arranged. The sedan pulled away just as another vehicle turned onto the street from the opposite direction. Inside, Nathan Cross watched the apartment building through darkened windows before calmly closing a folder containing Abigail's daily schedule. She trusts patterns, he said to his assistant. Tomorrow we change one. The following morning arrived bright and clear. Abigail hurried toward the bakery balancing 2 cups of coffee, her canvas tote, and an umbrella she no longer needed. Halfway across the intersection, she noticed an elderly woman struggling to gather groceries that had spilled across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Abigail rushed over. Apples rolled toward the curb, while cans of soup scattered in every direction. Do not worry, Abigail said warmly. We will have everything picked up in a minute. She knelt to collect the groceries, laughing when one stubborn orange escaped across the pavement. At that exact moment, a bicycle messenger sped around the corner, unable to see the orange rolling into his path. The rider swerved sharply to avoid it, losing control of the bicycle. Several pedestrians gasped as the bicycle slid sideways toward Abigail. Before anyone else could react, a strong hand gently caught her shoulder and guided her backward out of its path with calm precision. She looked up in surprise. Damien stood beside her, steady and composed, as though he had appeared from nowhere. The bicycle came to a harmless stop against a nearby newspaper stand, and the shaken rider immediately apologized to everyone nearby. Abigail let out a relieved breath before looking at Damien in disbelief. "Please tell me you are not following me." Damien held her gaze for a long second before answering carefully. "I was about to ask you exactly the same question." She laughed so hard that even the frightened cyclist smiled, but across the street, hidden behind the reflective windows of the bookstore, someone quietly lowered a camera after capturing every second of the encounter. And moments later, Nathan's phone vibrated with a single photograph that made his satisfied smile grow even wider. Abigail smiled all the way to the bakery, replaying the strange conversation in her mind until she laughed at herself. "Either New York has only one businessman," she whispered, "or the universe has an unusual sense of humor." Mia noticed the smile before Abigail even reached the counter. Someone looked suspiciously happy. Abigail slipped on her apron and tried to sound casual. "I had dinner with the subway guy." Mia nearly dropped a tray of muffins. "The handsome one?" Abigail shrugged. "I guess he is handsome." Mia stared at her in disbelief. "You guess?" Abigail laughed. "I was more focused on trying not to embarrass myself." "Mission accomplished?" Mia asked. Abigail thought for a second before grinning. "About 50% accomplished." The morning customers filled the bakery with cheerful conversation, and for a little, while everything felt perfectly ordinary again, Abigail poured coffee, boxed pastries, and accidentally wrote, "Have a sweet Tuesday," on a receipt, even though it was Friday. The customer smiled anyway. Just before lunch, the bakery door opened, and a woman in an elegant gray business suit stepped inside. She looked confident, polished, and completely out of place among the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread. She approached Abigail with a pleasant smile. "Miss Harper." "That is me." The woman handed over a cream-colored envelope. "Someone asked me to deliver this personally." Abigail accepted it with a puzzled expression. "Does it have a name?" "No, only instructions." Before Abigail could ask another question, the woman politely excused herself and disappeared back onto the busy sidewalk. Mia leaned across the counter immediately. "Open it." Abigail carefully unfolded the thick stationery. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "Meet me where the first journey began. 6 o'clock this evening. Bring the key." No signature. Abigail frowned. "This is getting weirder by the hour." Mia folded her arms. "You are absolutely not going alone." Abigail read the note again. "It sounds more mysterious than dangerous." "That is exactly how every mystery movie starts," Mia replied. Across town, Damien stood inside the conference room of one of his corporate offices while several executives discussed quarterly reports. Numbers filled the large presentation screen, but Damien's attention remained elsewhere. Vincent quietly entered the room and placed a thin folder beside him. Inside were photographs of the anonymous courier, the flower bouquet, and the latest handwritten note. "It arrived 15 minutes ago," Vincent said. Damien read the message once before closing the folder. "They want her to make the next move." Vincent lowered his voice. "Should we intercept her before she goes?" Damien looked toward the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. "No. If we stop her now, we lose whoever is leading us." "And if she walks into a trap?" Vincent asked. Damien answered without hesitation. "She will not walk in alone." Miles away, Nathan Cross watched security footage from the bakery with quiet satisfaction. Every step had unfolded almost exactly as he predicted. His assistant looked toward the monitor displaying Abigail reading the note. "Do you really believe she will come?" Nathan smiled. "She is curious. Kind people usually are. They believe every mystery deserves an explanation." The workday finally ended, and Abigail stood alone outside the bakery, holding the folded note in one hand and the silver key in the other. She looked toward the subway entrance across the street. "The first journey," she whispered. "That has to mean the train." She reached into her pocket for her phone, intending to call Mia, but before she could unlock the screen, a familiar black sedan quietly pulled to the curb beside her. The passenger window lowered just enough for Damien to meet her eyes. His calm voice carried only one sentence. If you are going where I think you are going, do not take another step until we talk. Abigail looked from the folded note in her hand to Damien, sitting quietly behind the lowered window. Evening traffic drifted past, as though nothing unusual was happening, yet the calm expression on his face carried a weight she had never seen before. She stepped closer to the car. You know where I was going? She asked. Damien glanced at the envelope she was still holding. Someone invited you to the subway station. Her eyes widened. How did you know that? He opened the passenger door. Please get in. I will explain what I can. Abigail hesitated for only a moment before climbing inside. The familiar scent of leather and cedar greeted her as the door closed softly behind her. Vincent remained in the driver's seat, offering a polite nod before easing the sedan into traffic. Abigail looked at Damien. Either you are incredibly good at guessing, or there is something you are not telling me. Damien folded his hands together. Both statements are probably true. She gave him a skeptical smile. I appreciate the honesty. For several blocks, neither of them spoke. Finally, Damien reached into his coat and placed a photograph on the center console. It showed the bouquet that had been delivered to the bakery before the silver key had fallen out. Another photograph showed the delivery van parked several streets away. A third captured someone watching the bakery through a camera lens. Abigail stared at the images in disbelief. Someone has been watching me. Damien nodded. Since before the flowers arrived. Her cheerful expression faded. Why? I do not know yet. She looked down at the silver key resting in her palm. This is because of this little thing, is it not? I believe it is connected. Abigail leaned back against the seat, trying to process everything. I thought my biggest problem this week was dropping cakes. She forced out a nervous laugh that disappeared almost immediately. Now I feel like I accidentally walked into someone else's story. Damien watched her carefully. Despite the confusion in her eyes, she had not panicked. She was searching for understanding instead of blaming anyone. That quiet resilience impressed him more than she realized. There is something I need to ask, Abigail said after a long silence. Are you actually just a businessman? Vincent briefly glanced toward the rearview mirror before looking back at the road. Damien answered carefully. I own legitimate companies. They employ thousands of people. That is not exactly what I asked. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. No, it is not. She studied him for several seconds before letting out a slow breath. I had a feeling there was more. Instead of pressing him further, she reached into her bag and pulled out the squeaky rubber chicken keychain while searching for a tissue. The toy let out its familiar, ridiculous squeak, filling the quiet car with unexpected comedy. Abigail covered her face. I cannot have one serious conversation without this thing embarrassing me. Even Vincent could not hide a brief chuckle. Damien shook his head with quiet amusement. Perhaps it has excellent timing. Abigail laughed despite everything. The tension eased just enough for both of them to breathe again. A few minutes later, the sedan stopped 1 block away from the subway entrance where Abigail had first met Damien. The station lights glowed against the darkening sky, and commuters moved in steady streams beneath them. Damien looked toward the entrance instead of opening his door. Whoever wrote that note expects you to arrive alone. Abigail turned toward him. But I am not alone. Damien met her eyes. No, you are not. Before either of them could step outside, Vincent's phone vibrated. He read the incoming message, and every trace of warmth disappeared from his expression. He quietly handed the screen to Damien. On it was a newly received photograph taken only seconds earlier. It showed the black sedan from above, and beneath the image was a single typed sentence. You brought company. Change of plans. Check locker number 37 before it is too late. Damien studied the message on Vincent's phone for only a second before handing it back. His expression remained composed, but Abigail noticed the subtle change in his eyes. Whatever was happening had become more serious. Locker 37? She asked quietly. What does that mean? Damien looked toward the busy subway entrance where hundreds of commuters moved in and out without realizing that one ordinary evening had become part of a carefully planned game. It means someone expected us to change our plans, he replied. Abigail folded her arms. Then maybe we should stop reacting exactly the way they expect. Damien turned toward her with genuine curiosity. What would you do instead? She thought for a moment before smiling nervously. Honestly, I would probably buy a giant pretzel, sit on a bench, and make whoever is watching wonder if I completely misunderstood the note. Vincent could not hide a small smile. Damien looked at Abigail for another second before saying, "That is not the worst idea I have heard today." She blinked. "Wait, you are serious?" People who create elaborate plans often depend on predictable reactions. Abigail shrugged. "Well, I have never been accused of being predictable." Instead of walking directly toward the lockers, the three of them crossed the street to a small snack stand outside the station. Abigail ordered a warm pretzel and somehow managed to get mustard on the sleeve of her jacket before taking the first bite. She laughed at herself while searching for a napkin. "I think I attract minor disasters." Damien accepted a napkin from the vendor and handed it to her before she could ask. "Only minor ones." For the first time since the mysterious messages had begun, Abigail noticed that he seemed less guarded around her. He did not smile often, but when he did, it reached his eyes. Across the plaza, inside a parked delivery van, a man lowered his camera in confusion. He quietly spoke into a headset. "They are not entering the station." Several miles away, Nathan Cross watched the live feed with calm interest instead of frustration. "Good," he said. "He is adapting. That makes this more interesting." His assistant frowned. "Should we abort?" Nathan slowly shook his head. "No. Locker 37 is only one move. There are always others." 20 minutes later, the evening crowd began to thin. Damien glanced toward Vincent, who gave the slightest nod. The surveillance reports showed no unusual movement inside the station anymore. Damien turned to Abigail. "We are going now." She finished the last bite of her pretzel and smiled. "I was wondering when the field trip would officially begin." Together, they entered the station where everything looked perfectly ordinary. Trains arrived. Announcements echoed through the platforms. Travelers hurried home after long workdays. Nothing suggested that locker number 37 held any special importance. Damien walked beside Abigail, while Vincent remained several steps behind, quietly observing everyone around them. They reached the row of metal lockers near the far corridor. Abigail removed the silver key from her pocket and looked at Damien. "Are you ready?" "As ready as we can be." Her hand trembled only slightly as she slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. A soft click echoed through the hallway. Abigail slowly opened the locker door. Inside sat a small wooden box wrapped with an old blue ribbon. Resting on top was a faded photograph of a much younger Damien standing beside an older gentleman Abigail had never seen before. Tucked beneath the photograph was a handwritten note containing only 7 words. "Ask Damien why he never told you everything." The words on the folded note seemed to echo through the quiet corridor long after Abigail finished reading them. She lowered the paper slowly before looking at Damien. She expected denial, confusion, perhaps even anger. Instead, she saw something far more unexpected. Regret. It lingered in his eyes for only a heartbeat before years of discipline quietly concealed it again. Abigail picked up the faded photograph from inside the wooden box. The younger Damien looked several years younger, wearing an easy smile she had never seen before. Beside him stood an older gentleman with kind eyes and silver hair, one hand resting proudly on Damien's shoulder. They looked less like business partners and more like family. "Who is he?" she asked softly. Damien answered without hesitation. His name was Anthony Bellini. Abigail studied the photograph again. "Someone important?" Damien nodded. "He taught me that strength means very little if it is never used to protect someone else." She looked back at him. "What happened to him?" Damien remained silent for several long seconds before speaking. He trusted the wrong person. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet sadness. Abigail realized he was choosing every word carefully. She folded the note and slipped it into the wooden box. "The message says you never told me everything." Damien met her eyes. "That part is true." She smiled gently, though uncertainty remained. "We have only known each other for a few days. I would actually be worried if you had already told me everything." Even Vincent glanced toward her with mild surprise. Damien looked at Abigail as though he had expected disappointment, but found understanding instead. "You are not angry?" he asked. She shook her head. "Everyone has chapters they are not ready to read out loud." Her answer lingered between them. Damien had spent years surrounded by people who demanded explanations, loyalty, or results. Very few had ever offered patience. Abigail carefully lifted the wooden box from the locker. Beneath it lay another envelope. This one carried only Damien's first name written across the front in elegant handwriting. He slowly opened it while Abigail respectfully looked away, pretending to study the old locker door instead. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There were no threats, no demands, only one sentence. You still protect people exactly the way Anthony taught you, which means you are finally predictable. Damien quietly folded the paper without another word. Vincent stepped closer. Sir. Damien slipped the letter into his coat pocket. We are leaving. As they walked toward the station exit, Abigail noticed that he seemed unusually distant. Not cold, thoughtful. Whatever connection existed between Anthony Bellini, the silver key, and the anonymous messages reached much deeper than she had imagined. Outside, cool evening air greeted them as city lights reflected across damp sidewalks. Abigail broke the silence first. Can I ask you one more question? Damien nodded. If the answer is no, that is all right. He waited. She looked at him with quiet sincerity. Are you trying to protect me from whoever is doing this? Or from your own past? Damien stopped walking. For the first time since they had met, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the busy street where strangers passed without noticing them. Finally, he spoke with complete honesty. I do not know anymore. Before Abigail could respond, Vincent's phone vibrated again. He checked the incoming alert, and his expression tightened. Sir, someone just entered Miss Harper's apartment. Abigail stared at him in confusion. That cannot be right. Nobody else has a key. Damien was already walking toward the waiting sedan. His calm voice carried unmistakable urgency without ever rising. Then we need to find out who does. The drive across the city felt longer than it actually was. Abigail watched the familiar streets pass outside the window while Damien remained focused on the road ahead, his calm expression revealing nothing except quiet determination. When the sedan finally stopped outside her apartment building, Vincent was already waiting near the entrance. There are no signs of forced entry, he reported. The front door was locked when we arrived. Abigail frowned. Then how could someone get inside? Damien looked toward the third-floor window where her apartment lights glowed softly. We are about to find out. Together they climbed the stairs. Abigail's heartbeat quickened as she unlocked the apartment door with her own key. She slowly pushed it open and froze. Nothing had been damaged. The furniture remained exactly where she had left it. The books on the shelves were neatly arranged. Even the forgotten coffee mug beside the sink had not moved. Everything looks normal, she whispered. Damien stepped inside, carefully studying the room. Then his attention settled on the small kitchen table. Resting at its center was a freshly baked apple pie beneath a clear glass cover. Abigail blinked twice. That was definitely not here this morning. A folded note rested beside the pie. She picked it up with trembling fingers while Damien quietly watched. The message was written in elegant handwriting. Kindness should never become collateral damage. The game is over. Abigail looked up in confusion. That is all it says. Vincent searched the apartment one final time before returning with a small answer. Sir, whoever came here did not take anything. They only left this. Damien understood before anyone else did. Nathan Cross had never wanted the key. He had never wanted the locker. He had never wanted the old photograph. He wanted one thing only. He wanted to discover whether Damien Moretti still possessed enough humanity to risk everything for a stranger. Damien had answered that question the moment he allowed an exhausted young woman to sleep peacefully on his shoulder instead of protecting only himself. The trap had never been about winning. It had been about measuring the man he had become. 2 days later, federal investigators quietly announced a financial investigation into several companies secretly controlled by Nathan Cross. Anonymous evidence had reached the proper authorities, exposing years of hidden fraud and manipulation through legitimate legal channels. Nathan disappeared from public life almost overnight, leaving behind unanswered questions and empty offices. No dramatic confrontation ever came. No final speech was necessary. The truth simply reached the people who needed it most. Several months later, spring sunlight filled a brand-new corner bakery with warmth and laughter. A wooden sign above the entrance read Harper's Hearth. Abigail smiled proudly as customers lined up for cinnamon rolls that no longer burned quite as often as they once had. She still misplaced measuring spoons. She still laughed at her own mistakes. She had simply learned that imperfect people could build beautiful lives. The bell above the door chimed softly. Damien walked inside, carrying a small bouquet of white daisies instead of lilies. Abigail looked up from the counter and smiled immediately. These flowers are much less mysterious. That was intentional, Damien replied. He placed the bouquet beside the register before quietly sliding a tiny velvet box across the counter. Abigail raised an eyebrow. Please tell me this is not another mysterious key. Damien smiled more openly than she had ever seen before. No more keys. She opened the box and found a simple diamond ring resting inside. For a long moment she said nothing. Tears gathered in her eyes, but the smile on her face never faded. You know, she whispered, our first meeting happened because I was too tired to stay awake. Damien gently took her hand. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything. She laughed through happy tears. I suppose I owe you one more apology for using your shoulder as a pillow. He softly shook his head. You never owed me an apology. Abigail slipped her hand into his, feeling the steady warmth that had once belonged to a stranger and now felt completely like home. Outside, the city continued rushing from one destination to another, unaware that two ordinary lives had found each other because of one unexpected moment of trust. Damien had learned that real strength was measured not by power, but by the courage to open his heart again. Abigail had discovered that kindness was never weakness, even in a complicated world. And as the morning sunlight filled the little bakery with the scent of fresh bread and new beginnings, they both understood that the safest place either of them had ever found was never a building, a fortune, or an empire. It was simply beside the person who chose them every single day.